Woman disrespects fallen soldier, but she has no idea who is behind her. The morning sun streaked through the airport's glass walls as Marissa Jones strode through Terminal B, her designer heels clicking against the polished floor. She'd done this walk hundreds of times before, and each time felt like another small victory in her carefully managed life. The sound of her steps mixed with the usual airport buzz, rolling suitcases, muffled announcements, and the constant hum of travelers rushing to their destinations. Marissa checked her watch, a habit she'd developed years ago when she first started climbing the corporate ladder. She was right on schedule, just as she liked it. Her carry-on bag, a sleek piece from last season's designer collection, rolled smoothly behind her as she navigated through the morning crowd. She'd mastered the art of airport efficiency. No checked bags, pre-checked security clearance, and a perfectly timed arrival that left no room for unnecessary waiting. "Excuse me," she muttered, more as a warning than an apology, as she maneuvered past a family moving too slowly for her taste. The parents were struggling with 3 kids and too many bags, but Marissa barely registered their stressed expressions. In her mind, their lack of organization wasn't her problem. She'd learned early in her career that success meant keeping your eyes forward and your mind focused on the goal ahead. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, probably another email about the conference she was heading to. As a senior marketing executive, Marissa was used to being in constant demand. She pulled out her phone without breaking stride, her thumb automatically entering the password she'd used for years. 3 new emails popped up, and she smiled slightly. Everything was going according to plan. The conference in Chicago would be another chance to prove herself. She'd prepared her presentation weeks in advance, rehearsed it until every word flowed naturally, and even arranged meetings with potential clients during her downtime. Efficiency was her trademark, and she wore it like a badge of honor. As she walked, other travelers seemed to part before her, sensing her purposeful energy. Some gave her admiring glances. She knew she cut an impressive figure in her tailored suit and perfectly styled hair. The occasional disapproving look from those she brushed past didn't bother her. They simply didn't understand what it took to succeed in her world. The morning light caught her wedding ring, a simple band she wore more out of habit than sentiment these days. Her marriage, like everything else in her life, ran on a carefully planned schedule. Date nights every other Friday, calls during lunch breaks, and perfectly coordinated vacations twice a year. Her husband had learned to adapt to her rhythm, or at least that's what she told herself. Marissa paused briefly at a coffee stand, ordering her usual double espresso with the practiced ease of someone who'd long ago memorized their preferences. The barista started making her drink before she'd finished paying. She was a regular here, another small victory in her efficiently managed world. While waiting, she scrolled through her presentation one last time, making mental notes about potential questions that might come up. The coffee was hot and strong, just how she needed it. Taking a sip, she continued her brisk walk toward her gate, barely noticing the growing number of people gathering near the windows. Her mind was already in Chicago, rehearsing her opening lines and planning her responses to potential competitors who would be at the conference. The first sign that something was different came when she noticed a group of airport staff walking with unusual purpose toward one of the gates. Marissa initially dismissed it as routine airport operations, but then she saw the military uniforms. A small group of soldiers moved with measured steps, their faces set in solemn expressions that seemed out of place in the usually hurried atmosphere of the airport. People began to slow down around her, some stopping completely. Marissa felt a flash of irritation as her path became increasingly blocked by the growing crowd. She tried to navigate around them, but the usual gaps in the crowd were closing as more people gathered. The quiet that fell over the terminal was almost physical, like a heavy curtain dropping over the usual airport chaos. Ridiculous, she thought, checking her watch again. Her gate was just ahead, past this unnecessary gathering of people who seemed to have forgotten that airports were meant for traveling, not standing around. She spotted a small opening in the crowd and made her move, pushing forward with determined steps. As she maneuvered through, she caught glimpses of what was causing the delay. A flag-draped casket was being carefully guided down the jet bridge by an honor guard, their movements precise and coordinated. Marissa felt a moment of recognition. She'd seen something like this on the news before, but quickly pushed the thought aside. She had a schedule to keep. The crowd's respectful silence only amplified the sound of her heels as she walked past. A few heads turned in her direction, faces showing surprise and disapproval at her apparent lack of respect. Marissa lifted her chin slightly, reinforcing her belief that she was the only one being practical in this situation. Death was a part of life, she reasoned, and stopping everything for ceremonies was simply inefficient. Near the casket, a small group of people stood close together, clearly family members of the deceased soldier. Their grief was visible even from a distance, but Marissa kept her eyes forward, focusing instead on the gate numbers ahead. She'd learned long ago that getting involved in other people's emotions was messy and unproductive. The sound of quiet crying reached her ears as she passed the family group. For a brief moment, something tugged at her consciousness, a memory of her own grandmother's funeral years ago, but she pushed it away with practiced ease. Success required focus, and focus meant keeping unnecessary emotions at bay. Her phone buzzed again, providing a welcome distraction. Another email about the conference, confirming her dinner reservation with potential clients. Marissa smiled, pleased that at least some things were running according to plan. She responded quickly, her fingers flying over the screen with practiced efficiency. The atmosphere around her remained heavy with emotion, but Marissa had already mentally moved on. In her mind, she was reviewing her schedule for the day, landing time, check-in at the hotel, quick change of clothes, and then the opening reception. Everything was planned down to the minute just the way she liked it. She reached her gate just as the boarding process was about to begin, or should have begun. The delay from the military ceremony was causing a ripple effect through the terminal's operations. Marissa took her place in the priority boarding line, automatically pulling up her boarding pass on her phone. Around her, the reverent silence continued, but she remained in her own world, protected by the barrier of indifference she'd carefully built over years of climbing the corporate ladder. The delay at the gate was starting to wear on Marissa's nerves. She stood in the priority boarding line, tapping her foot against the carpet while refreshing her flight status app every few minutes. Around her, other passengers waited quietly, many still watching the honor guard ceremony with respectful attention. The usual pre-boarding bustle had been replaced by an unusual hush that made Marissa's frequent sighs sound louder than she intended. She glanced at her watch again, 15 minutes behind schedule now. In her mind, she started calculating the domino effect this delay would have on her carefully planned day. The car service she'd arranged in Chicago would need to be notified, her hotel check-in might be rushed, and the pre-conference meeting she'd scheduled would definitely need adjusting. Each minute that ticked by felt like another small crack in her perfectly structured plans. "This is getting ridiculous," she muttered under her breath, pulling out her phone to send a quick email to her assistant. Her fingers moved rapidly across the screen. Landing delayed. Adjust schedule accordingly. Short, direct, and to the point, just like everything else in her life. She hit send with perhaps a bit more force than necessary, her frustration finding an outlet in that simple action. The gate agent stood at her desk, speaking in hushed tones with other staff members. Marissa watched them, trying to catch any hint of when normal operations would resume. The agents' faces showed nothing but solemn respect for the proceedings, which only irritated Marissa more. In her mind, they should be focusing on getting the flight back on schedule. She looked around at her fellow passengers, searching for any sign that someone else shared her frustration. Most people stood quietly, some with their hands over their hearts, others simply watching with reverent attention. A young man in a business suit similar to hers caught her eye, but instead of the shared annoyance she hoped to find, his face showed only patient respect. The sound of military commands carried across the terminal as the honor guard moved with precise steps. Each movement was carefully choreographed, each gesture measured and deliberate. To Marissa, it all seemed unnecessarily slow and ceremonial. She'd seen enough military movies to understand the concept, but experiencing it in person, especially when it directly affected her schedule, was testing her patience. Her phone buzzed with a response from her assistant. Understanding delay. Adjusting Chicago schedule. Car service notified. The message should have brought relief, but instead, It reminded Marissa of all the carefully laid plans now requiring modification. She'd spent weeks coordinating this trip, timing everything just right to maximize efficiency. The temperature in the terminal seemed to rise with her growing frustration. She shrugged off her jacket, draping it over her carry-on handle with practiced precision. Even this small action was performed with the efficiency that characterized her every move. A child nearby pointed at the flag-draped casket, asking his mother questions in a loud whisper. Marissa felt her jaw tighten. Now she had to deal with both the delay and the distraction of curious children. The boarding area remained surprisingly full despite the delay. Usually, passengers would have dispersed to nearby shops or restaurants during such a wait, but the ceremony seemed to hold everyone in place. Marissa found this particularly frustrating. Not only was her schedule disrupted, but she couldn't even find a quiet spot to review her presentation one last time. She pulled out her tablet, determined to make use of the unwanted downtime. Her presentation slides appeared on the screen, each one a testament to her meticulous planning and attention to detail. But the quiet sounds of grief from the nearby family made it difficult to concentrate. The contrast between her corporate bullet points and the raw emotion just yards away created an uncomfortable tension she couldn't quite ignore. Minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Marissa's attempts to focus on her work were repeatedly interrupted by the measured movements of the honor guard and the occasional sniffles from the gathered crowd. She found herself reading the same slide 3 times without absorbing any information, her usual laser focus scattered by the unusual circumstances. "People die every day," she muttered under her breath, closing her tablet with a sharp snap. "Why hold up everyone else?" The words left her mouth before she could consider their impact, hanging in the quiet air like unwelcome intruders. A few nearby passengers shot disapproving glances in her direction, but Marissa pretended not to notice, busying herself with reorganizing her carry-on bag. The movement behind her was so subtle, she almost missed it. The slight shifting of weight, the quiet clearing of a throat. She became aware of a presence, someone standing closer than the usual unspoken rules of personal space would allow. The presence felt deliberate, almost commanding, though she couldn't explain why. Marissa turned slightly, more out of instinct than curiosity. The man standing behind her was tall, his posture straight despite his civilian clothes. Something about the way he held himself made her think of the military recruitment posters she occasionally saw. There was an unmistakable air of authority about him, even in his casual dress. His eyes met hers briefly, and Marissa felt an unexpected flutter of discomfort. They were kind eyes, but they held something else, a depth of experience that made her want to look away. She turned back around quickly, suddenly very interested in her phone screen, though she wasn't really seeing the emails she pretended to read. The man's presence remained, a silent reminder of something she couldn't quite identify. She could feel his steady gaze, not hostile but deeply aware, as if he were seeing past her expensive suit and carefully maintained exterior to something she preferred to keep hidden. The urge to move away warred with her stubborn determination not to be intimidated. More commands echoed through the terminal as the honor guard continued their solemn duty. Marissa found herself holding her breath without realizing why, the atmosphere around her becoming increasingly heavy with unspoken meaning. The man behind her remained still, his silence more eloquent than any words could have been. She risked another glance over her shoulder, this time noticing details she'd missed before. His bearing, the way other military personnel in the area subtly acknowledged him with respectful nods, the small pin on his lapel that she now recognized as indicating high rank. The realization that she'd been muttering complaints in front of a high-ranking military officer made her cheeks warm with embarrassment. But pride made her straighten her shoulders and lift her chin. She was successful in her own right, she reminded herself. Her world of corporate deadlines and market shares was just as important as their ceremonies and traditions. The thought felt hollow even as it formed, but she clung to it, using it as a shield against the growing discomfort of the situation. The general, she was sure now that's what he was, made no move to confront her directly. His presence remained steady, a quiet reminder of a world she'd chosen to ignore, a value she dismissed in her pursuit of efficiency and success. The contrast between her impatience and his dignified silence began to create a tension that even her well-practiced indifference couldn't quite dispel. The tapping of Marissa's foot against the carpet grew more insistent as the minutes ticked by. She could still feel the general's presence behind her, steady and unwavering, like a shadow she couldn't shake. The usual comfort of her controlled world began to slip away, replaced by an unfamiliar sensation of being watched and, somehow, found wanting. She pulled out her phone again, though she'd checked it just moments before. The screen showed no new messages, no urgent emails demanding her attention. For once, she wished for some crisis at work, anything to justify her behavior or at least distract her from the growing tension in the air. "Absolutely unnecessary," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. But in the quiet of the terminal, even her whispers seemed to carry. She felt rather than saw the general shift his weight behind her, and something in that small movement made her stomach tighten. It wasn't fear exactly. Marissa Jones didn't do fear, but something else, something that made her want to move away and stand her ground all at once. The honor guard continued their precise movements, each step measured, each gesture deliberate. Marissa watched despite herself, noting how young some of the soldiers looked. One of them couldn't be much older than her nephew, she realized, then quickly pushed the thought away. Personal connections made things messy, and messy wasn't efficient. A small sound escaped her, something between a sigh and a scoff, and this time she knew the general heard it. The quality of his silence changed, becoming more pointed, more present. Marissa found herself standing straighter, her spine stiffening as if preparing for a confrontation she didn't want but somehow couldn't avoid. She turned slightly, meaning to just glance over her shoulder, but found herself caught in his direct gaze. His eyes were clear and steady, holding years of experience she couldn't begin to understand. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them like a physical presence. "Is there a problem, sir?" she asked, trying to inject her usual confidence into the words. They came out sounding more defensive than she'd intended, and she saw something flicker in his expression. Not anger, but a deep disappointment that somehow felt worse. The general took a small step forward, closing the distance between them slightly. "No problem," he said, his voice low and controlled. "Just observing." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Marissa's certainty waver. She'd faced down corporate boards and hostile takeovers, but something about this man's quiet dignity made her feel small in a way she hadn't experienced since childhood. Around them, other passengers continued to watch the ceremony, their respect evident in their silence and stillness. Marissa became acutely aware of how her restless movements and muttered comments must appear to him. But admitting discomfort wasn't in her nature, so she lifted her chin slightly, clinging to her familiar armor of efficiency and purpose. "Well, some of us have schedules to keep," she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. As soon as they left her mouth, she knew they were a mistake. Not because they were wrong. In her world, they made perfect sense, but because of how they landed in this moment, in this space filled with grief and respect. The general's response wasn't immediate. He took a moment, his eyes moving from Marissa to the flag-draped casket and back. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm, like a teacher correcting a student who should know better. "Schedules," he said, letting the word hang in the air between them. "Yes, we all had schedules today, including the young man in that casket." The words hit Marissa like a physical force. She opened her mouth to respond, but for once, found herself without a ready reply. The general continued, his voice remaining low but carrying an authority that made others nearby turn to listen. "He had plans too," the general said. "College next fall, a wedding in December, a whole life scheduled out ahead of him." He paused, letting his words sink in. But he put all that aside when his country called. "Sometimes, Ms. Jones, the most important schedule is the one that allows us to honor those who gave up all their tomorrows for our todays." Marissa felt heat rise in her cheeks. How did he know her name? Then she remembered her boarding pass, displayed on her phone screen for the past several minutes. Of course, He'd been standing close enough to read it. The realization that he'd been paying that much attention made her even more uncomfortable. She tried to hold onto her annoyance, to wrap herself in the familiar comfort of deadlines and efficiency, but the general's words had cracked something in her carefully constructed facade. The sounds of grief from the family nearby suddenly seemed more immediate, more real. The young soldier standing at attention beside the casket could have been her neighbor's son, the one who used to mow her lawn in the summers. "I didn't mean," she started, but the words trailed off. What hadn't she meant? To be disrespectful? To dismiss someone's sacrifice? To show such obvious disdain for something she didn't understand? The general waited patiently, his presence steady and undemanding, yet impossible to ignore. Other passengers had grown quiet, some pretending not to listen while others watched openly. Marissa felt exposed in a way that all her corporate success and carefully cultivated image couldn't protect her from. This wasn't her world of quarterly reports and market projections, where everything could be measured and controlled. The honor guard began another series of precise movements, their steps echoing in the quiet terminal. Marissa found herself watching their faces, so young, so serious, so committed to their duty. She noticed details she'd ignored before: the shine on their shoes, the perfect creases in their uniforms, the way they moved as one unit, each motion precise and meaningful. "Freedom," the general said quietly, drawing her attention back to him, "isn't free. And sometimes, the price isn't just paid by those in uniform." He nodded toward the grieving family. That mother lost her only son. That young woman lost her fiancé. That little boy lost his big brother. Their schedules, their plans, their whole worlds changed forever. Marissa swallowed hard, her throat suddenly tight. The woman she'd assumed was the fallen soldier's mother was being supported by two others, her grief evident in every line of her body. The scene was far removed from Marissa's world of boardrooms and business deals, yet somehow it felt more real than anything she'd experienced in years. The general's next words were so soft she almost missed them. "A moment of respect," he said, "is such a small thing to give in return for such a great sacrifice." Then he fell silent again, leaving Marissa to wrestle with thoughts and feelings she'd spent years pushing aside in her pursuit of success and control. The silence in the terminal grew heavier, wrapping around Marissa like a thick blanket she couldn't shake off. She found herself unable to look away from the honor guard's movements, each step now seeming to carry meaning she hadn't noticed before. Her phone buzzed in her hand. Another email, another deadline, another meeting, but for the first time in years, she didn't immediately check it. The general remained nearby, his presence a constant reminder of her earlier words. She wanted to move away, to find another spot to wait for boarding, but something kept her rooted to the spot. Pride, maybe, or something deeper, she couldn't quite name. The controlled world she'd built for herself was cracking around the edges, letting in emotions she'd long ago decided were inefficient. A young soldier in the honor guard caught her eye. He couldn't have been more than 20, his face set in careful concentration as he helped guide the casket. Marissa found herself thinking of her younger brother at that age, not much younger than her, but always looking up to her, always trying to match her drive for success. When was the last time she'd really talked to him? Not just the quick calls on birthdays or the rushed conversations during holidays, but really talked? The thought made her uncomfortable, and she tried to push it away, to focus instead on her upcoming presentation. But the words on her phone's screen blurred together, meaningless in the face of what was happening around her. The grieving mother's quiet sobs cut through her usual defenses, making her think of her own mother, who she'd been too busy to visit last month. "Small price to pay," she heard someone nearby murmur, and the words echoed the general's earlier statement. A small price, a few minutes of delay, a slightly adjusted schedule. Compared to what? Compared to a life given in service? Compared to a family's endless grief? The comparison made her previous complaints seem petty, almost childish. She watched as another member of the honor guard adjusted the flag draping the casket with precise, careful movements. Each fold was exact, each touch respectful. These soldiers had probably done this ceremony dozens of times, yet there was nothing routine about their actions. Every gesture carried weight, carried meaning, carried respect. The businessman who'd been standing near her earlier caught her eye again. This time, she noticed the small pin on his lapel, a veteran, perhaps, or someone with military connections. He stood perfectly still, his hand over his heart, his eyes focused on the ceremony. His laptop bag sat forgotten at his feet, his phone tucked away despite the constant alerts she could see flashing on its screen. Marissa's own phone felt heavy in her hand now, like it was pulling her back to a world that suddenly seemed less important than it had just hours ago. She'd spent years building her reputation on being unstoppable, unshakable, always in control. But standing here, watching this display of quiet dignity and deep respect, she felt something shift inside her. The general moved slightly, and she caught a glimpse of medals partially visible under his jacket lapel. How many ceremonies like this had he attended? How many soldiers had he sent into danger? How many letters had he written to families? The questions came unbidden, making her see him differently than she had before. Her fingers tightened around her phone as another message came through, her assistant, updating her about the schedule changes in Chicago. The words seemed to come from another world, one where everything could be managed, controlled, optimized. Here, in this moment, she faced something that couldn't be measured in profit margins or quarterly reports. A child's voice broke through her thoughts, clear and innocent. "Mommy, why is everyone so quiet?" The mother's hushed explanation carried to where Marissa stood. "Because sometimes being quiet is how we show respect, honey. Sometimes it's how we say thank you." The simplicity of the explanation made Marissa's throat tight. She thought about her own way of showing respect, or rather, her lack of it. How many times had she pushed past people, dismissed their feelings, ignored their struggles, all in the name of efficiency? How many moments of human connection had she missed while checking her email or planning her next meeting? The honor guard began another series of movements, their steps echoing in the hushed terminal. Marissa found herself counting them, noticing how each soldier moved in perfect synchronization with the others. There was efficiency here too, she realized, but it was different from her kind of efficiency. This wasn't about saving time or maximizing profit. It was about showing respect, about honoring sacrifice, about acknowledging something greater than individual success. She glanced at her watch again, but this time it wasn't with impatience. Instead, she found herself wondering about the fallen soldier's last moments. Had he checked his watch that final morning? Had he sent one last text to his family? Had he known what was coming, or had it been sudden, unexpected, final? The questions made her uncomfortable, but for once, she didn't push them away. The general's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes the most important schedule is the one that allows us to honor those who gave up all their tomorrows for our todays. She dismissed it as sentimental at first, but now the words seemed to carry a weight she couldn't ignore. Around her, other passengers stood in respectful silence, many with their heads bowed. She noticed details she'd missed before: an elderly man wiping tears from his eyes, a teenager lowering his headphones, a flight attendant standing at attention. Each person seemed connected to this moment in their own way, part of something larger than their individual journeys. The family of the fallen soldier huddled closer together as the ceremony continued. Marissa found herself studying their faces, seeing not just their grief, but their love, their pride, their connection to each other. When was the last time she'd allowed herself to be that vulnerable, that open, that real? Her presentation slides still waited on her tablet, filled with charts and graphs and carefully crafted proposals. They represented months of work, yet suddenly they seemed less substantial than the simple, solemn ceremony unfolding before her. The numbers and projections couldn't capture what she was witnessing: the cost of freedom, the weight of sacrifice, the depth of love and loss. The general shifted slightly, and Marissa realized she'd stopped fidgeting, stopped checking her phone, stopped trying to control everything around her. Something had changed, not just in the air around her, but inside her. The carefully constructed walls she'd built to keep emotion at bay had developed cracks, letting in feelings she'd forgotten she could have. Her upcoming meetings in Chicago still mattered. Of course they did. The presentations still needed to be given, the deals still needed to be closed. But standing here, watching the ceremony, feeling the weight of the general's presence behind her, Marissa began to understand that efficiency wasn't everything. Some things couldn't be rushed, some moments couldn't be optimized, some experiences needed to be felt fully, completely, without trying to control them. The honor guard completed their final movements, their ceremony drawing to a close with the same precision with which it had begun. Around the terminal, the heavy silence started to lift, replaced by the gradual return of normal airport sounds. Marissa felt the shift in the air, like a spell breaking, and found herself taking a deep breath as if she'd been holding it for hours. The gate agent's voice came over the speaker, announcing that boarding would begin shortly. The words seemed to break whatever spell had held the crowd in respectful silence. People began to move, reaching for bags they'd set down, checking phones they'd kept silent, returning to their regular airport routines. Marissa watched as the transformation happened, feeling oddly disconnected from the sudden burst of activity. She noticed the general gathering his things, preparing to head to his own gate. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave her a slight nod before turning away. Marissa felt a surge of relief mixed with something else, something that felt uncomfortably like shame. But she pushed that feeling aside, choosing instead to interpret his nod as acknowledgement of her right to her opinions, her priorities. First-class passengers may now begin boarding, the gate agent announced, and Marissa automatically stepped forward, her body moving with the muscle memory of countless flights. Her boarding pass appeared on her phone screen with a practice tap, and she felt herself sliding back into her familiar routine. The efficiency of it was comforting, like putting on a well-worn coat. As she waited in line, she began mentally rearranging her schedule. The delay hadn't been as long as she'd feared. She could still make her afternoon meetings if she skipped lunch. Her assistant had already adjusted her car service, and the hotel was expecting her late arrival. Everything was falling back into place, back under her control. The business traveler with a veteran's pin passed by, heading to another gate. He didn't look at her, but Marissa found herself watching him go, noting how he paused and turned to face the direction of the honor guard one last time before continuing on his way. The gesture was small but deliberate, and something about it made her stomach twist uncomfortably. She pushed the feeling away, focusing instead on her immediate tasks. Her phone buzzed with new messages, clients confirming meetings, colleagues sending last-minute updates, her assistant checking in. This was her world, she reminded herself. This was where she excelled, where everything made sense. The emotional weight of the past hour began to feel like a strange interruption, a temporary deviation from her normal path. The line moved forward, and Marissa found herself at the gate podium. The agent scanned her boarding pass with mechanical efficiency, and for once, Marissa was grateful for the impersonal nature of the interaction. No meaningful glances, no weighted silence, no unspoken judgments, just the simple transaction of business travel. As she walked down the jet bridge, her heels clicking against the metal floor, Marissa felt herself straightening, rebuilding her usual confident posture. The ceremony was over, the general was gone, and she could return to being the person she'd worked so hard to become. Focused, efficient, successful. But something felt off, like a picture hanging slightly crooked on a wall. She couldn't quite name it, couldn't quite fix it, so she did what she always did with uncomfortable feelings. She ignored it, pushed it aside, focused on the next task, the next goal, the next achievement. Finding her seat in first class, Marissa stowed her bag with practiced ease. The familiar routine of settling in for a flight helped push away the lingering discomfort from the terminal. She checked her phone one last time before switching it to airplane mode, responding to emails with her usual crisp efficiency. Each tap of her fingers on the screen felt like another step back toward normalcy. The other passengers filed past her seat, the usual parade of business travelers and vacationers. She caught fragments of conversations about the ceremony, whispered words of respect, quiet discussions about sacrifice and duty. Marissa kept her eyes on her phone, pretending not to hear, pretending not to care. She'd already spent enough time thinking about things that didn't directly affect her bottom line. A flight attendant offered her a pre-takeoff drink, and Marissa accepted gratefully. The cool glass felt solid in her hand, real in a way that the earlier ceremony had not. This was tangible, measurable, part of the world she understood. She took a sip, letting the familiar taste of her usual drink choice ground her in the present moment. Her seatmate arrived, another business traveler, judging by his suit and laptop bag. They exchanged the brief, impersonal nods that were customary in first class, an unspoken agreement to respect each other's space and privacy. No meaningful conversations required, no emotional investments needed. Perfect. As the last passengers boarded, Marissa pulled out her tablet, determined to review her presentation one more time. The slides appeared on the screen, full of the graphs and charts she'd spent weeks perfecting. The numbers were comforting, clear, unchanging, predictable. Unlike people, unlike emotions, unlike ceremonies that made her question things she'd rather not examine. She heard more whispered conversations about the fallen soldier as people settled into their seats. Some passengers were still wiping tears from their eyes, others speaking in hushed tones about similar ceremonies they'd witnessed. Marissa kept her focus on her screen, determined not to be drawn back into that world of emotion and uncertainty. The general's words tried to surface in her mind, but she pushed them away, replacing them with profit projections and market analyses. She'd won, hadn't she? She'd stood her ground, maintained her principles. The delay hadn't destroyed her schedule, and she'd get to Chicago in plenty of time for her meetings. That was what mattered. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration, and Marissa went through the motions of paying attention, though she could recite the instructions from memory. The routine was comforting, another example of efficiency at work, another process she understood and could control. But as the plane began to taxi, something caught her eye through the window. The honor guard, still visible in the distance, standing at attention as the fallen soldier's family was escorted to a waiting car. The sight made something twist inside her chest, a feeling she couldn't quite name and didn't want to examine. She turned away from the window, focusing instead on her tablet screen. The numbers and charts blurred slightly before her eyes, but she blinked hard, forcing them back into focus. She was Marissa Jones, senior executive, known for her efficiency and drive. She hadn't gotten where she was by letting emotions cloud her judgment or ceremonies delay her schedule. The hollow feeling in her chest would pass, she told herself. The strange weight of the general's presence would fade. The memory of the grieving family would blur with time. Everything would return to normal, her normal, where success was measured in dollars and minutes, not in quiet moments of respect or shared humanity. But even as she thought this, something deep inside her knew that her victory was as empty as the air miles she was about to collect. She'd won the battle with her schedule, but lost something else, something she wasn't quite ready to name or acknowledge. The plane reached cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign dinged off with a familiar chime. Marissa had just opened her laptop when the captain's voice came over the intercom, different from the usual welcome announcement. There was a weight to his words, a solemnity that made passengers look up from their books and devices. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that we have the honor of transporting a fallen soldier home today. Army Specialist Michael Torres, age 23, gave his life in service to our country last week. His family is aboard with us, and I ask that you join me in a moment of reflection to honor his sacrifice. The name hit Marissa like a physical blow. Michael Torres. Not just the soldier or the fallen service member anymore. A real person with a name, an age, a story. 23, barely older than her nephew, who just started his first job after college. She found herself doing the math without wanting to. Born in 2001, probably played video games, probably had a smartphone, probably made TikTok videos like all the other kids his age. The cabin fell silent, but this time Marissa didn't feel the urge to check her phone or review her presentation. Instead, she found herself thinking about Michael Torres. Had he been funny? Serious? Did he like sports? Did he have a favorite movie? Questions she'd never know the answers to kept popping into her head, making the young soldier more real with each passing moment. She remembered her earlier complaints, her muttered words about unnecessary delays, and felt her cheeks burn with shame. The family was on this very plane. They must have heard her. The thought made her stomach churn. She'd been so focused on her schedule, her meetings, her importance that she'd completely failed to see the humanity of the situation. A flight attendant moved quietly through the cabin, her usual cheerful efficiency replaced by gentle solemnity. As she passed Marissa's seat, their eyes met briefly, and Marissa saw something there, not judgment exactly, but a kind of knowing sadness that made her want to look away. The silence in the cabin felt different from the enforced quiet of first class. It wasn't about status or privilege now. It was about respect, about acknowledging something bigger than individual comfort or convenience. Marissa noticed how other passengers had stopped their usual in-flight activities. Laptops remained closed, phones dark, conversations paused. She thought about Michael Torres's mother, somewhere behind her in the main cabin. Was she looking at photos of her son? Auditing his last text messages? Planning a funeral no parent should ever have to plan? The questions came unbidden, each one making Marissa's throat tighter, her earlier self-assurance crumbling like dry sand. Through the window, clouds drifted past, white and peaceful against the blue sky. Somewhere down there, life went on as usual, people rushing to meetings, checking emails, worried about deadlines. Marissa had been one of them just hours ago, convinced that her schedule was the most important thing in the world. Now, at 35,000 feet, that certainty felt as insubstantial as the clouds outside. Her presentation was still open on her laptop, the slides showing graphs of projected growth and market expansion. The numbers that had seemed so crucial earlier now felt trivial, almost embarrassingly so. What did quarterly projections matter compared to a life given in service? What was a delayed meeting weighed against a family's grief? The sound of quiet crying drifted forward from the main cabin, muffled but unmistakable. Marissa closed her eyes, trying to block it out, but the sound seemed to bypass her ears and go straight to her heart. She remembered the general's words about schedules and sacrifices, understanding them now in a way she hadn't before. Her hand moved to her phone automatically, a habitual gesture, but she stopped herself. Instead, she found herself thinking about her own family. When was the last time she'd really been present with them, not just physically there while mentally reviewing work emails? When had she last listened to her mother's stories without checking her phone? When had she last played with her nephew without thinking about pending deadlines? The captain's voice came back on, announcing their flight path and expected arrival time. The routine information felt jarring after the previous announcement, like switching from a funeral to a business meeting without pause. Marissa noticed how carefully he spoke, how he seemed to weigh each word with extra consideration, aware of the grieving family on board. A baby started crying somewhere in the main cabin, and Marissa heard gentle shushing sounds as the parent tried to quiet them. Under normal circumstances, she would have been annoyed at the disruption. Now, she found herself thinking about how life went on. Babies cried, people traveled, business continued, while some families' worlds stopped turning completely. The flight attendant passed by again, this time carrying tissues to someone a few rows behind Marissa. The simple gesture, so human, so caring, made Marissa think about all the times she'd brushed past people's emotions in her rush to get things done. How many tears had she ignored? How many moments of human connection had she missed? Her seatmate shifted slightly, and she noticed he was reading something on his tablet. It was a news article about military casualties, with a photo of young soldiers in uniform. He caught her looking and gave a sad smile. "My son's in the service," he said quietly. "Every time I hear about one of these." He trailed off, but Marissa understood. Every fallen soldier was someone's child, someone's brother, someone's friend. The weight of her earlier behavior settled more heavily on her shoulders. She thought about how she must have looked to others in the terminal, the impatient woman in expensive clothes, too important to pause for a moment of respect. The memory made her cringe inwardly. What had she really gained by those few minutes of rushed efficiency? Through the window, America passed beneath them. Cities, farms, mountains, all connected by invisible threads of shared humanity. Somewhere down there, other military families were going about their days, carrying the constant weight of worry about their loved ones in uniform. Marissa had never thought about them before, had never considered the daily sacrifice of military families. The captain announced they were starting their descent into Chicago. The familiar announcement would usually trigger Marissa's mental checklist, checking emails one last time, preparing for her upcoming meetings, planning her fastest route through the airport. Instead, she found herself thinking about Michael Torres's final journey home, about how every mile brought him closer to his final rest. Her usual drive to maximize every minute felt hollow now, replaced by a growing awareness of the cost of her efficiency at all costs mindset. The meetings waiting for her in Chicago still mattered, but somehow they'd lost their urgent edge. For the first time in years, Marissa found herself questioning not just her actions, but the values that had driven them. The plane touched down in Chicago with a gentle bump, and the usual rustle of passengers preparing to deplane began.
But something was different this time.
Instead of the usual rush to stand and grab bags, people remained seated, an unspoken understanding passing through the cabin. They would wait until the fallen soldier's family had disembarked. Marissa sat quietly in her first-class seat, watching as others showed the patience and respect she'd been unable to muster earlier. Through the small window, she could see several uniformed personnel gathering on the tarmac, forming another honor guard. The sight made her chest tight, remembering her dismissive attitude toward the earlier ceremony. As the family passed by her seat, Marissa found herself unable to look away. The mother's face was tear-stained but dignified, supported by family members who moved like shells of themselves. A young woman, perhaps Michael's sister or girlfriend, clutched a folded flag to her chest as if it were the most precious thing in the world. These weren't just strangers anymore. They were people whose pain Marissa could finally see and feel. The terminal was visible through the window now, and Marissa noticed a group of veterans gathering near the gate. Some wore uniforms from different eras. Others wore civilian clothes with military caps or pins. They stood straight and solemn, waiting to pay their respects to a brother-in-arms they'd never met, but with whom they shared an unbreakable bond. When passengers were finally allowed to deplane, Marissa moved slowly, no longer feeling the usual urgency to be first off the plane. Her carry-on seemed heavier somehow, weighted down with the understanding she'd gained during the flight. As she walked up the jet bridge, she could hear the muffled sounds of another ceremony beginning. The scene in the terminal stopped her in her tracks. The group of veterans she'd seen from the plane had formed a corridor of honor, standing at attention as Michael Torres's family passed between them. Each veteran saluted with precise movements, their faces showing a mix of sorrow and pride that made Marissa's throat tight. Among them, she spotted the general from earlier, now in his full dress uniform. He stood tall and straight, his medals catching the terminal's fluorescent light. The sight of him brought back her earlier shame, but it was different now, less defensive, more instructive. She understood now what he'd been trying to show her. Other passengers gathered quietly around the edges of the scene, many wiping tears from their eyes. Business travelers in expensive suits stood shoulder to shoulder with families in vacation clothes, all differences forgotten in this moment of shared respect. Marissa noticed how many had their hands over their hearts, a gesture she dismissed as theatrical just hours ago but now understood as deeply meaningful. A young man in army fatigues caught her attention. He couldn't have been much older than Michael Torres, and his face showed a pain that seemed almost personal. Perhaps he'd known Michael, or perhaps he simply felt the weight of what could have been his own fate. He stood rigidly at attention, but tears rolled freely down his cheeks. The busy Chicago terminal had transformed into something sacred, a temporary cathedral of grief and honor. The usual airport sounds seemed muted, as if the world itself was showing respect. Even the announcements over the PA system had stopped, leaving only the soft sounds of quiet crying and measured footsteps. Marissa found herself drifting toward the edge of the gathering, her usual purposeful stride replaced by uncertain steps. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, probably her car service wondering where she was, but for once, she didn't immediately reach for it. Some things she was learning were more important than immediate responses. The general noticed her presence, and their eyes met across the crowd. This time, Marissa didn't feel defensive or challenged. Instead, she felt a deep gratitude for the lesson he'd taught her, though the learning had been painful. He gave her a small nod, different from the one earlier. This one carried understanding rather than judgment. A group of veterans approached the general, each showing obvious respect for his rank and presence. They spoke in low voices, sharing memories of their own service, their own losses. Marissa watched their interaction, noticing how they supported each other with subtle gestures and quiet words. This was a brotherhood she'd never understood before, a connection forged through shared sacrifice and understanding. One of the older veterans was telling a story about his own homecoming decades ago, his voice thick with emotion. Back then, he said, we didn't get this kind of welcome, but we made sure it would be different for those who came after us. The words carried a weight that made Marissa think about how things change, how understanding and respect can grow if people are willing to learn. The general listened to the veterans with genuine interest, showing none of the impatience Marissa had displayed earlier. Each story seemed to matter to him, each person's experience valued. It was a different kind of efficiency, she realized, not about saving time, but about honoring each moment, each person, each sacrifice. When the veterans moved away, the general turned toward Marissa again. This time, she didn't try to avoid his gaze. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and gave him a small, respectful nod. His response was a smile, gentle, understanding, forgiving. It was the kind of smile that acknowledged growth, that recognized the difficulty and importance of learning hard lessons. Around them, the terminal was slowly returning to its usual rhythm. Passengers rushed to connecting flights, announcements resumed. Life continued its forward motion. But something had changed, not in the physical space, but in Marissa's perception of it. The world seemed bigger somehow, more connected, more human. Her phone buzzed again, and this time she did check it. Her assistant had rearranged her afternoon schedule, pushing back her first meeting to give her time to get settled. Before today, she would have been frustrated by the change. Now, she felt grateful for the space to breathe, to process, to honor what she'd witnessed. The general was speaking with another group now, sharing quiet words of comfort with Michael Torres's family. Marissa watched how he carried himself, strong enough to bear others' grief, humble enough to share their pain. It was a different kind of strength than what she'd spent years cultivating in boardrooms and business meetings. As she finally turned to leave, Marissa caught one last glimpse of the family. They were surrounded by love and support, strangers becoming friends in their shared moment of grief. She thought about her own family, about the connections she'd let fade in her pursuit of success. Perhaps it was time to rebuild those bridges, to remember what really mattered in life. The walk to her waiting car felt different than her usual stride through airports. Her heels still clicked against the floor, her luggage still rolled perfectly behind her, but something fundamental had shifted. She carried with her now a new understanding, a weight that wasn't burdensome but transformative. The general's final nod had been a gift, an acknowledgement of growth, of learning, of becoming more than she had been before. A week after returning from Chicago, Marissa sat at her desk, staring at her calendar. The familiar blocks of color representing meetings, calls, and deadlines filled the screen, but she saw them differently now. Between the rigid schedule lines, she'd started adding small spaces, moments to breathe, to think, to remember. The presentation she'd been so worried about had gone well, though she'd delivered it differently than planned. Instead of launching straight into market projections, she'd taken a moment to acknowledge the people behind the numbers. Her colleagues had noticed the change, some commenting on her more approachable demeanor. She wasn't sure how to explain that it had taken a fallen soldier and a general's quiet wisdom to teach her about true leadership. Her phone lit up with a news alert, another military ceremony in the city. Before, she would have scrolled past it without a second thought. Now, she found herself reading the details, noting the time and location. The soldier being honored had served in the same unit as Michael Torres. The connection made her chest tight, remembering the family's grief in the airport. "Ms. Jones," her assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Your brother's on line 1. A week ago, she would have asked for a message, claiming she was too busy. Today, she picked up immediately. Her brother sounded surprised at her quick response, even more surprised when she asked about his kids, without checking emails during their conversation. They talked for 20 minutes, the longest personal conversation she'd had during office hours in years. He told her about his son's baseball game, his daughter's dance recital, the small moments she'd been missing while focused on quarterly reports and market shares. When he mentioned coming to visit, she found herself suggesting dates instead of making excuses. After the call, Marissa walked to her office window, looking out at the city below. People rushed along the sidewalks, focused on their own urgent matters. She wondered how many of them were like her old self, too busy to notice the humanity around them, too focused on success to see the cost of their single-mindedness. The memory of the general's steady gaze came back to her. She'd looked him up after returning home, learning about his distinguished career, his advocacy for veterans, his commitment to honoring fallen soldiers. His quiet dignity in the airport hadn't been a show. It was who he was, a leader who understood that true strength came from respecting others, from acknowledging sacrifice, from valuing what really mattered. Her eyes fell on a small American flag she'd bought for her office after returning from Chicago. It wasn't the grand gesture of the airport ceremony, but it was a daily reminder of what she'd learned. Sometimes, during particularly hectic days, she'd look at it and remember Michael Torres, 23 years old, who'd never get to attend another meeting, chase another deadline, or hug his family again. Opening her laptop, Marissa began drafting an email to her team. They had a major project deadline approaching, and normally she'd be pushing for extra hours, demanding constant updates. Instead, she found herself writing about balance, about understanding personal commitments, about recognizing that while their work was important, it wasn't worth sacrificing everything else. A notification popped up, another meeting request. Before automatically accepting, she paused to read the details. It would conflict with her nephew's school play next week. In the past, there wouldn't have been any question about which to choose. Now, she found herself typing a polite decline, suggesting an alternate time. The world wouldn't end if they met an hour later. Later that afternoon, walking through the office, Marissa noticed things she'd previously overlooked. The family photos on her employees' desks told stories of lives outside these walls. The casual conversations she used to consider time-wasting now seemed like essential threads in the fabric of human connection. She stopped to listen when people spoke, really listen, not just wait for her turn to direct or decide. The military tribute she'd read about was scheduled for the weekend. Instead of filling that time with work as she usually would, Marissa found herself driving to the ceremony. She stood quietly among the crowd, understanding now why these moments mattered. Each person there carried their own story, their own connection to service and sacrifice. She recognized some of the veterans from the airport, their faces etched in her memory. They nodded to her, perhaps remembering her from that day, perhaps simply acknowledging another person who'd come to show respect. The general wasn't there, but his influence was, in the way she stood patiently, in how she felt the weight of the moment, in her understanding of what it meant to honor sacrifice. After the ceremony, Marissa found herself talking with a young soldier who'd served with both Michael Torres and the soldier being honored today. He shared stories about their time together, small moments of friendship and courage that never made it into official reports. She listened, really listened, her phone staying untouched in her purse. Driving home, she took a different route, one that passed by her mother's house. On impulse, she stopped. Her mother's surprise at the unannounced visit quickly turned to joy. They sat in the kitchen, drinking coffee and talking about nothing in particular. Marissa noticed how her mother's hands shook slightly when holding her cup. How had she missed that before? How many changes in her loved ones' lives had she been too busy to see? That evening, instead of bringing work home, Marissa sat on her balcony, watching the sunset. Her phone buzzed occasionally, but she let it wait. The city stretched out before her, millions of lives intersecting in countless ways. Somewhere out there, Michael Torres's family was learning to live with their loss. Somewhere, other soldiers were serving, other families were waiting, other stories were unfolding. She thought about the changes in her life since that day in the airport. They weren't dramatic. She was still successful, still driven, still focused on achieving goals. But something fundamental had shifted. Success felt different now. measured not just in profits and promotions, but in moments of connection, in respect shown, in humanity recognized. The next morning, preparing for work, Marissa caught her reflection in the mirror. She looked the same: stylish suit, perfect makeup, professional demeanor. But her eyes were different, softer somehow, more aware. The general's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes the most important schedule is the one that allows us to honor those who gave up all their tomorrows for our todays. She straightened her jacket, checked her phone out of habit, but didn't immediately start answering emails. Instead, she took a moment to remember the airport ceremony, the grieving family, the general's quiet wisdom, Michael Torres's sacrifice. These memories weren't interruptions anymore. They were essential parts of who she was becoming. Walking into the office, Marissa carried herself differently. Her confidence came not from control now, but from understanding. She'd learned that true strength lay not in pushing past others, but in pausing to acknowledge their humanity. Her world hadn't gotten smaller since that day in the airport. It had grown immeasurably larger, richer, more meaningful. And in that growth, she'd found a different kind of success, one measured not in minutes saved, but in moments honored.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.